this is now an existential crisis, and we have, in a way, a conceptual crisis. Like just understanding where we are and what this is, this moment. Like all of history is behind us. Every book you've ever read, every battle, every empire, all of that is just there, right? Just right behind us. And now we are in this position of emerging awareness that in order that this that civilization in some form continue, we have to move quickly, and the arts can help us do that by giving us a shared sense of this moment and its gravity, but also of what's possible and how quickly that tipping point could be reached.
Another episode of the Conscient podcast. I'm with Stephen Huddart in Montreal. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you, Claude.
So we're near your home along the Lachine Canal, I believe.
That's right.
And we're going to have a conversation and a bit of a sound walk, not unlike the one I had with Jane Engel, who's a former colleague of yours. And the thing about sound walking is that usually you don't talk. You just listen. But talking is part of the soundscape, right? So it's okay to converse, but it's also about paying attention to what's around us. So what are you hearing now, Stephen?
Well, right now I'm hearing a large crane doing something over at the former Dominion Textile Works, but there's also some bird song in the background here. And if we are really quiet, we hear the sound of the wind.
Visually, it's very beautiful. We're about to cross the bridge. So I'm very happy that you accepted to talk with me, because we've been talking for at least 10 years, if not more, in various capacities, and I've really appreciated your advice and support and just friendship over the years, talking about art and so many other things. So maybe I'll just ask you to introduce yourself to the audience, and then we'll start talking about reality and ecological grief. But there's so much we could talk about, we'll have to stop at some point.
Okay, well, thank you, and thank you for this invitation and this wonderful opportunity to share some thoughts with you. I'm Stephen Huddart, and 6 months ago I stepped down as the CEO of the McConnell Foundation, where I had worked for 18 years, and so I'm somebody who's transitioning out of a period of intense professional work at that level, and we're living in St. Henry, which of course is in a sense the cradle of the industrial system that powered Canada's colonial development. Well, first of all, I think we need to acknowledge that this is traditional and unceded Mohawk territory, Tiohtià:ke, and it's living in the time of reconciliation. We have it's such an important cultural shift taking place at all levels that is relational on the one hand, it's structural on the other, and it's also, I think, very much a part of this time that we are living in, and I think the relationship between reconciliation and our growing awareness, emerging awareness of the ecological crisis and our responsibility to deal with that in a way that is just and humane and thoughtful and creative is all of a bundle. So I'm getting past who I am, but I'm very much somebody who lives. I live my work, and I'm somebody who all my life have really been involved in social change and cultural change in some ways, from early, in my teen years, I was a student activist in Melbourne, Australia, and edited a student newspaper and marched against the Vietnam War and went through those adventures. But kind of disjointed way. I think looking back now, I see that when I came back to Canada to go to school initially to study journalism at Carleton, and just couldn't see why I would be doing that. In 1969, left and got involved in filmmaking and did some work in Toronto, CBC, and private documentary company that was exploring futures of different subjects. Worked in New York for a while, and then spent the next 7 years in Latin America when I was 21 to 28. Through that period of being a foreigner in Latin America and a white Anglophone, became aware of the fundamental injustices and terrible responsibilities of coming from a privileged background and having those things to account for and to dismantle and to work through. So that didn't happen all at once, but there were certain moments when I came close to or was involved in indigenous communities in the Amazon, in Chiapas, in Oaxaca, and I've experienced a sort of fundamental shift in how I viewed the world. So I understood linear processes and logical constructs and so on, but came to appreciate a more holistic and connected and in ways that your reality podcast talked about, some of the difficult to describe dimensions of reality.
Mm-hmm. Writer Sherry Mitchell. We must tune in to our ability to see beyond the physical reality that surrounds us and awaken to the vast, unseen world that exists.
And I was unsuccessful in getting a film career started, and so got involved in from waiting on tables to working in a natural food company, running a couple of retail stores, and really learning how to eat in the process, because that was something that I needed to do. And from there, got involved with my brother in starting a jazz cafe in Vancouver. That was sort of Vancouver's home of live jazz for a few years in late 80s, early 90s. And in each of these chapters, and there are more that followed, I've kind of followed instinct or responded to opportunity to create change in my environment or with the people who I knew and was working with. So.
I appreciate hearing the trajectory, right, and the continuity. I was just going to do a little soundscape moment, because as we were walking, of course it's quite a windy day, and I think that's a train. And trains are always very exciting. There it is. Hello. Very exciting sound events, though a bit overwhelming. But so many beautiful things happened on our path as I was listening to you, and sort of opening up to our feet changing texture and the bikes going by. It's just a very lovely, lively moment to talk about these things.
So that on the previous $20 bill, there's a quote from Gabrielle Roy. It's in micro type, but it's basically says that how could we have the slightest chance of knowing each other without the arts? And that struck me when I read that and thought about the distances that grow up between us, the polarization, the prejudices, all of those things, and how the arts create this bridge between peoples, between lonely people, between dreamers and all people. That the arts have that ability to link us together in a very personal and profound and important ways. So, yeah, that's homage Gabrielle Roy.
Well, thank you.
Saint Henry.
And Saint Henri. Well, it's good to know
They
where we are.
Born in Saint Boniface, and you wanted to take credit for that.
Franklin, Manitoban.
Is that okay if we just kind of insert a little?
Well, it's all
ellipsis,
it's all good because
brackets?
it's a conversation, right? And in this moment, you're telling me part of your life story, which I find really interesting because some of it I did as well, and we're both relatively recently retired, in a way, public servants. You work for a foundation, but you're serving the public, right? And so now it's like a time in life where there's more freedom and possibilities. So I've chosen to do a podcast. I know you're working on various projects. And the world really needs both leadership and for people like you and I to step back and leave room for others, right?
Yeah.
It's that mix that I find...
It's so important. Yeah. It's true. I think was as I left the foundation, I left with this great sense of relief, to be honest, that I didn't have those responsibilities. And it was a pretty intense year. 2020 for most people who had work, it meant that you were, whether in the arts or in the social sector, it was just suddenly a lot to do. A lot, great changes in resource flows and decision processes, and with the emergence of a global movement after George Floyd's murder, a lot to process there as well about privilege and power and the ways to unpack, to dismantle those structures. One of the projects that I'm involved in is part of something called the Transition Innovation Group. We write op-eds for people on matters related to societal transition, but where we bring a little brains trust together to work with someone who is in a position of visible leadership and whose ideas we can discuss and put into a format that can be shared in the media. So in that sense, it's a stepping back, but also contributing to the conversations that leaders can have.
Well, you'll be joining us. Today is June 17th. Tomorrow there's the first meeting of the group called, what's it called? Scale. Sectoral Climate Arts Leadership for the Emergency, and it's working with Seth Klein and his sense of urgency around the climate emergency. His good war book. He actually mentioned to me 2 years ago that it was a must read, and I did read it. Yeah. And so it's nice to see the mobilization, collaboration also of activists and artists and other people from different sectors, all around not just solving the climate issue, but reinventing the world, essentially, which is what reauthoring the world, as David Maggs would put it. That's where we're at, that's the moment.
Absolutely.
Political Science Professor Thomas Homer Dixon. Today's global spanning crises all stem from common sources: belief and values that are too self-centered, political systems that are too hidebound, economies that are too rapacious, and technologies that are too dirty for a small, crowded planet with dwindling resources and fraying natural systems.
Before we can reauthor the world, it's, I think, important to go through that phase of realizing how grievous our presence here has been, whether as white colonialists destroying indigenous cultures, languages, families, children. All of that is something terrible to have to acknowledge and process and come through. I took part in several of the TRC hearings, one in Montreal and Edmonton and Ottawa, and hearing those voices of the survivors, and just extraordinary courage that it took, but extraordinary suffering and injustice that was there. And they were but at that point, the most recent and extreme examples of a colonial system that was creating tremendous pain and conducting a genocide, simply put. So just acknowledging that brings one to grief. And so from there, we have links to the grief that we experience when we look at the ecological grief, or we experience that, which you've highlighted in the podcasts.
One of the reasons that it's important to me is that I needed to go through that in order to move towards action more effectively. That's a personal thing. I don't know if other people experience it, but I had to do that. So I'm curious to know.
Yes, it's absolutely the case. And here I have to confess to, I guess, a kind of ecological crime that over which I grieved. So when I was living in Peru, in the Amazon, I had a partner in a news agency that was nationalized overnight and put us out of work. And two of us ended up working in the Amazon out of sheer desperation. We had done the research for a film on oil exploration in the upper Amazon in Peru. This was 1974, I guess, when OPEC had turned off the taps and the West wasn't getting any oil from the Middle East. So we were preparing to do a film story about that, and including its ecological ramifications or implications and so on. But instead, we ended up with some degree of desperation, applied for and got jobs in the seismic surveying work that was going on. And this was Peru had a national petroleum company, a state petroleum company that owned 51% of everything, but they were contracting out with foreign oil companies. And so I went to work for Western Geophysical, and this was, we had no money to get out of here. We were stuck. Anyway, this was how I found myself in some of the most remote corners of the Peruvian Amazon, and making what was first or very early contact with some of the forest peoples in that region, and doing so in a way that respected to the extent that was possible Indigenous, you don't want to say tenure because I didn't think of that, but Indigenous presence. So respectfully approaching, waiting, asking permission, bringing gifts, and so on, which were not at all part of the company protocol, but we were so far away from anybody that could tell us what to do that we did it our own way, and it worked. We weren't assassinated, as had happened to others working in that area, but it had a profound effect on me that, I was behind whatever it was I was doing. If they did find oil, this was going to be a tremendous threat to the peoples and the ecosystems that I was visiting, that I was working in. And so, when I came back to Canada after that, it was just with an idea of studying anthropology and to bridge anthropology and filmmaking in order to document that issue. And for a variety of reasons that did not work out, but I grieved in coming back here and seeing just how much we depend on oil in that system, and those attitudes of, we go out there to the frontiers and we get the oil and we keep the machine going. It's
not so much the oil as it is the exploitation, right? Because the oil in and of itself is a resource that has been managed, maybe could be managed, but if it's exploiting people's lands in ways that are unethical, which it unfortunately generally is,
right?
It's part of the pattern of how we've behaved for 100, 200, 500 years, and that has to change or else we won't survive.
Right.
We, whoever we are.
Right.
But thanks for sharing that. That's good to get it off your chest.
Thank you. Yeah. So, but grief is something that I think feeds resolve, and so if I have any way of paying back that debt that I incurred by being in the that wave of exploitation, then it's through what I'm able to do or support others in doing to mitigate or in other ways absolve that sin against nature and people. So anyway,
well, you chose to work for a foundation where the wealth came from industrialization, right? So there's a bit of it's a contradiction, but certainly a tension there.
Yeah. Well, I think philanthropy, McConnell was an extraordinary human being. Far-sighted, industrious, intelligent, generous, and yet relatively little known in Canada.
Yes. As a leader.
As an influencer and shaper of this city and of Canada. So I hadn't heard of McConnell or the McConnell Foundation when my wife brought home a brochure. We were living in Vancouver one day, and I'd been talking about maybe doing a master's online or something because I was ready to go back to school. I was almost 50, and she said, "Oh, look at this." And I was like, "Wow, this sounds great." And that was the McGill-McConnell program, which I was fortunate enough to become a part of, and thus met Francis Wesley and Tim Broadhead. And it just happened at a time in my life when I was ready to go to university. I hadn't done that. And it was life-changing for me, and it meant, among other things, coming to Montreal for 3 or 4 stage, 2-week periods, and opportunity to get to know the city and meet a cohort of leaders.
There are other things I want to talk about that are more in the realm of things that you've experienced also in terms of intersectorality, collaboration, innovation. Those are things that I think people, especially artists, would benefit from hearing from. I mean, they can hear them, but they can hear them directly from you because you've set up programs, you've had the challenges of, we can talk about TP3, that network of environmental organizations, how we need to organize ourselves not just as artists but as citizens, to move through. And in Quebec here they call it la transition écologique, which is quite lovely, because the ecological transition, we need to know where we want to go. We want, I think, we want to go to a balanced world where we're a part of nature, not dominating nature.
Activist Sheila Watt-Cloutier. It's important to recognize how closely linked environment, health, economics, culture, and rights are in our society. The earth is a living, breathing entity, just the same as our bodies are. Our survival utterly depends on living in nature, not apart from it.
Now we can talk a bit more about some of the more, I'm not saying practical, but some of the issues that I raise in the reality program about the role of the arts, and more specifically how the arts can have a much more impactful presence and role in the climate emergency, but more broadly in what we call la transition écologique, the ecological transition. So where can we start with that? You've done a number of projects, and you've done a lot of partnerships and collaborations. So what would you like to say about that?
Yeah, I guess there's several angles we could look at this question from. There is the actual production of art, of works of art, of course, and I think there are tremendous examples of where that has awoken people, raised awareness, and led to important action. I think of films like An Inconvenient Truth and the body of work that participatory media has done with Spotlight exposing the corruption in the Catholic Church and the role of journalism in surfacing that, or more recently, the Judas, what's the title? Help me out here.
Black Judas?
Black Judas, thank you.
Yeah.
About the, what was really going on with the Black Panther. So those expository structures and works are extremely important. But I think we're also talking now about culture in the broadest sense, about how do we become a culture that is rapidly adapting to these extraordinary circumstances in which we find ourselves. And part of that is I think, it's not just about closing down oil pipelines and so on, although that's important. The decarbonization agenda is what I'm referring to here, really. I think we have to more broadly dematerialize to become less dependent on consumerist behaviors and the acquisitional appetites that capitalism is sort of constantly enforcing and strengthening, and move to, from a more material culture to yes, a more spiritual culture, a more culture that is able to enjoy being here, that experiences an evolutionary shift toward connection with nature, with all that entails, with other human beings, and the enjoyment and celebration of culture. And so I think there's those two perspectives that the arts have an essential and so important and yet difficult challenge before them. And I think it's time to perhaps stop thinking, in the work that I've been doing in the social innovation space, we often talked about sort of innovation at the edge. Go to the edge just to see what's new, what's different, and so on. And I think we have to bring this conversation to the center. This is now an existential crisis, and we have, in a way, a a conceptual crisis. Like just understanding where we are and what this is, this moment. Like all of history is behind us. Every book you've ever read, every battle, every empire, all of that is just there, right? Just right behind us. And now we are in this position of emerging awareness that in order that this that civilization in some form continue, we have to move quickly, and the arts can help us do that by giving us a shared sense of this moment and its gravity, but also of what's possible and how quickly that tipping point could be reached.
Activist Greta Thunberg. For me, hope is the feeling that keeps you going, even though all odds may be against you. For me, hope comes from action, not just words. For me, hope is telling it like it is.
We've seen, through Greta Thunberg's global conversation, through the George Floyd tragedy and its aftermath, that human consciousness is able to move to new states of compassion, understanding, and thirst for justice and commitment to those changes fairly quickly. We need that. And I think the arts can help us to experience that in ways that are shared and that create a broader sense of what's possible and why it's important. And one of the things that I think is in this mix of ideas about the transition from a material culture to a spiritual or communitarian and spiritual culture is that we're going to be looking at a diminishment, a necessary diminishment, an essential diminishment of private space and private property and private acquisition and private, and a consequent enhancement of the public space. Let's all have, we're walking through this beautiful urban national park, which is the Lachine Canal system. We have canoers, kayakers, and bird watchers,
and runners,
and also, and we're right beside a big flour mill here. It's been there for 50 years. Robin Hood flowers with trains coming in and out. So we can kind of, I think, at our best, retain those essential aspects of the industrial era and those other eras that preceded us, while moving into the co-creation of a culture of pleasurable engagement, intellectual exploration, science-based innovation around pharmaceuticals, the design of an education system that is really appropriate for the times in which we find ourselves, of a health system. There's just so many systemic issues on the sort of the structural side the arts can point toward, while also strengthening the relational capital that we need, the trust, the awareness, and the recognition and respect that it takes to move forward together.
Well, I would challenge you on that in as much as we're based on a endless growth model, right? Digital technologies are just going crazy. We're not really thinking about the impact of those servers. We're just going fast and I think wildly. And a lot of the growth is unsustainable. The carbon budget is one example, but there are many other metrics of severe restraint that's necessary in order to have a sustainable life for future generations. And so I'm not really challenging you, I'm asking you, how do we do that? Because you've worked in innovation fields, right? Because innovation is not about growth, it's about better, right? I assume.
That's right.
but better, how do you do better? And these are big questions, of course. But when we talk about the arts can play a role, I think artists have to be empowered with collaborators and knowledge and resources to do this work, right? They can't just in their studios dream up a better world and not apply it somehow. So I'm asking you a very broad question, but how do we kind of make that work? Or are there examples of methodologies that really actually can work in the real world to have the best of both worlds, have the tools that we've built and the wonderful infrastructure that we enjoy throughout the world, by the way, not just in the developed world.
Right.
And leaving artists aside, how do we do that?
Activist Naomi Klein. What the climate needs to avoid collapse is a contraction in humanity's use of resources. And what our economic model demands to avoid collapse is unfettered expansion. Only one of these sets of rules can be changed, and it's not the laws of nature.
Yeah, well, there's that wonderful moment in the Reality podcast where you're quoting Naomi Klein saying that we've got on the one hand an urgent need to shrink humanity's footprint on the planet in order to survive, to avoid ecological collapse, and on the other, an economic system that's predicated on continuous growth.
Yeah.
Only one of those can change.
That's right.
So,
It's not nature.
thank you, Naomi. And I think the ways that arts can do this are manifold, and actually I feel like I should be asking you this question.
Yeah.
Because
I'm thinking
when you
about
were when you were the inter-arts office person, we sat together at a table where circus arts and disability arts, indigenous arts, and other art forms that were not part of the kind of core activities of the council, the Canada Council, and where we were asking that question, holding practitioners, leaders from those fields, giving them the space to express what they saw as necessary for their work to move forward. And I would say that the results have been very positive. Mm-hmm. We have a circus arts field, we have disability arts has grown, etc. Mm-hmm. So that's, I think it's not for me to answer the question, but rather for people in the affected communities and in the responsible granting institutions, funders of all kinds, to create the space for that conversation to happen. Mm-hmm. And if I might say that one of the most intriguing, for me personally, aspects of those days when we were working together was the exploration of public art, publicly engaged pageants and mural making and so on. There were just, you shared a film that you had produced around that time that inspired me to think about what's it like to live in a culture where the arts are more integrated, they're more part of the everyday. And when we see it, we fall in love with it. We're about to walk past the Atwater Market where there's a display of community arts curated over the past couple of years from children, from artists, professionals, and so on. And there's a permanent or semi-permanent, like it'll be there for a few months for the summer, display of that work. And a community that can share its culture with itself and celebrate that is a more resilient community. And I think where there's perhaps, to take this idea of the public arts one step further, I've been doing a little bit of reading about the Chautauqua movement lately, and thinking about how, on the one hand, we need community conversations about where are we, what's happening, how do we explain this to our kids, how do we help people who are feeling extraordinarily stressed about this or despairing or grieving not feel alone. And so what the Chautauquas did was, in that interregnum between, the sort of like end of the 19th century, early 20th century, these traveling shows were educating. They were giving people exciting experiences, exposure to ideas and technologies, and just shared experiences that had people talking. And so, what does a modern version of the Chautauqua look like?
Everywhere.
Yeah, as something we do. And in the Australian Aboriginal culture, they had this circuit that was traveled across the entire country around but it was 200 years long. So you would give over, a family or a young person might join that circuit and wouldn't be heard from for 4 or 5 generations. But when it came back, boy, remember that? Remember grand, great. And so how do we create a culture that...
This is a soundscape moment. Mary Schaefer would say this is like a sound event, and it is noisy, but it's also an activity, hopefully a positive one, building, but it's something we need to make note of, Do we want to have more of this kind of construction in our lives? Yes, temporarily, but, there's a whole balance thing of the soundscape that we can talk about later, but it's always on my mind, and it's related to what you're talking about, of listening and of circles and of community conversations. Mm-hmm. And that's missing, right? That's like a missing element in our, even in the way that we live, to talk to each other. Now, it's been hard with COVID, right? It's been particularly hard because we haven't been able to sit down,
Yes.
and so we're suffering. All of humanity is suffering from the COVID. But anyway, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
But I think you're touching on something that's essential to this moment, which is that as we come out of the pandemic and all of the restrictions that it imposed on us, we do face this kind of fork in the road. Are we going to blow off a lot of steam and just keep on going? Is this going to be like the 1920s, all over again? And excessive consumerism and what the hell, who knows what's going on? I'm going to have a good time while
like that.
Or is this, a moment when we treasure some of those things that we've had more of during this time? The time in nature, the time with other species, dogs, cats, birds, and so on. And use this as a rebalancing, a necessary rebalancing and preparation for the next phase of this evolutionary moment. In paleogeological terms, this is a moment of punctuated equilibrium. When you look at the species in the geological strata that existed before a moment of punctuated equilibrium, like a volcano erupting or something like that, and the morphology of the species before that event, and the shape of species and the number and types after are radically different. Mm. And we're in that moment of intense, things are happening so quickly. Mm. And so people that I'm working with these days say, I can't believe we're having this conversation. Those people are actually listening. I mean, Mark Carney is talking about, talking to the Pope about changing capitalism, and we have these, people in systems going, universities, presidents and leaders, and anywhere you look, people are asking, is this the best we can do? How do we adapt? What are we going to do in light of, yes, the climate crisis, yes, the gap between rich and poor? And so there's a lot to work with.
Yeah.
And artists, I think, are needed in those conversations.
Yeah.
And not just artists, but also the people who are administering, leading arts institutions and organizations. Well,
there have been some interesting examples. Soul Pepper Theatre Company convened 300 or so artists and cultural workers on June 2nd, not too long ago, for a green session. They're going to do more, and the Scale Coalition's going to work with them. And there's growing momentum, and I wouldn't call it awareness, I would call it action. Like, we're past the point of thinking about this.
Right.
We're deep into a new way of working and thinking, both in terms of our own footprint, but also the way that we want to interact with our publics. So that's positive. I think that's, and I think there will be growing momentum there. Simon Poe at Canada Council and Jesse Wente, and they're very open to new ways of working because they know that it's coming.
Yes.
And then they're saying, artists, come to us with ideas, right?
Right.
Come to us with, because there's public resources that can be invested in these creative endeavors. But what I'm trying to do, ever so modestly, is to help artists be aware of those opportunities, tools, knowledge, inspirations, points of inspiration that lift up your spirit, and you say, "Oh my, look what's been done. Of course, it's possible." Yeah, and your work has been inspired me that way because you're very optimistic, but you're not. You get things done. So there's a combination of optimism and practicality that I think that's walking your talk, right? You say it and you do it. Good for you. You've had a great run at that, and I hope you'll do more.
Yeah, thank you.
That was quite a walk, Stephen. Thank you. Is there anything else that we haven't talked about that you'd like to add before we call it a day?
Well, I guess, for a couple of things. One is that sort of the arts, the business models that support the arts, and whether there's room to explore public trusts. We're at the point now where musicians are selling off the rights to their body of work to corporations that will benefit from the royalty structures and so on ad infinitum. But I think there's room to create something of a parallel nature in the public space that might...
like a public trust.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And I don't know who might be talking about that, but anyway.
Well, let's put that out there.
Sure. And then I think also with funding generally, I think philanthropy, of which I've played, spent a fair amount, 18 years, I think is ripe for business model innovation, and rather than having multiple applicants apply to multiple funders, a different model. It's time to test different models where a social mission is described and populated with ideas and people and creative capacities, and funders are invited to contribute to it, whether at a local level or whatever point in sort of tiering of capital and assets could be contributed. Not just the money, of course, but also the convening capacity in other ways. So I think there's that whole field of funding, and the arts have been an innovator in that space because you do have, you have to remind me the name of that single portal application process that reaches multiple. Yeah, thanks. So I think there's interesting things to explore there that would float in other ways, raise up the work of artists in society. We didn't talk about what I'm majorly involved in these days. A lot of my time is really on how do we influence capital flows? How do we integrate the granting economy with all that it has and all of its limits with the rest of the economy, with pension funds, with institutional investors of various kinds, of family offices and so on, because we need all of these resources to be lining up and integrated in a way that can enable grassroots activity to be seen, supported, nurtured, and so on, linked to the broader systems change that we so urgently need. And that takes the big capital moving. So that's a space that I'm currently exploring and looking for ways to have that conversation. So, anyway.
Well, I'm sure you'll have artists at the table inevitably. You're an artist yourself, so that helps.
Of some sort.
Well,
but I think it's the capacities that artists have for creatively reimagining, for looking afresh at where we are and where we can go next that are so critical to this moment. So, and may I conclude by thanking you, sir,
thank you.
for a lovely conversation and for all the work you've done to create the space for this conversation to be happening. So, really, really honored and
thank you.
pleasure to have been part of it. Thank you.